God, I look to you. You're where my help comes from. Give me wisdom. You know just what to do, yeah.
Today is World Marriage Day, and we welcome today our engaged couples who are about halfway through their preparation for the sacrament of matrimony, so we can pray with them and support them as they make this journey towards marriage. And before we get to Job and diagnosing his depression and coming up with a treatment plan for him, I want to make a point about something that's connected, obviously, to marriage. This week, a film premieres based on a book that was wildly popular. The book was called 50 Shades of Grey. And I would encourage you not to go see the movie, except I won't do that. I'll tell you, do not go see the movie. It's really the worst form of pornography there is, because it pretends to be a very cute romance novel, and it's anything but. And unfortunately, when we support films like this, we just encourage filmmakers to make more films like this. They think this is what people want. And the book itself, and I'm sure the movie as well, makes a few really terrible points that we have to be careful not to absorb. And the first is that if you are rich, really good looking and successful, you could have whatever kind of violent sexual appetite you want, and people will be okay with it. You know, it's the story of a man who's good looking, very much wanted by other women, has a lot of money, is very successful. And he makes women sign a contract to maintain confidentiality about what he does to them and giving him permission to do whatever he wants with them. Secondly, it sends the message that sex is completely for pleasure, and all love, all romance should be removed from the situation. Thirdly, it tells girls that if you hang around long enough, put up with his violence, eventually he might love you and he might change. It's a terrible message to send to young girls. And the message it sends to guys is pretty simple. You can do whatever sexual violence you want to a girl, and she will love it. That's what the movie teaches. And it's not, I think, a value that we should uphold in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I think it's not a value anybody in America should support. So don't see the movie, and encourage your friends not to see the movie, and tell them what it does, how it harshens relationships, how it gives a really distorted view of what it means to love and be loved. Now, on to Job. Job's reading that we heard is really dramatic. At the end, he says, "My life is like the wind. I shall never see happiness again." Many of us have probably felt that, I'm sure, at different times in our life. And the book of Job, as you know, hits square on the question of suffering. Why is it that we're suffering? Why do we suffer, and how do we come to explain it? And the book of Job tries to explain it. It goes in many different directions. Is it my fault that I suffer? Is it your fault that I suffer? Is it the fault of a capricious universe that conspires against me? Is it that God is a manipulative God who inflicts pain and punishment? What's the answer to suffering? You know, just this week I read a report from the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child about the situation over in Iraq. And it said this: the systematic killing of children belonging to ethnic and religious minorities by the so-called ISIL includes mass execution of boys, beheadings, crucifixions, and burying alive children. And a high number of children who have also been abducted by ISIL, many of whom were severely traumatized from witnessing the murder of their parents and are subject to physical and sexual assaults. Now that's happening right before our eyes. And the question, of course, that comes up, how could a good and just God allow such innocents to suffer? It's a legitimate question, and it's certainly one that deserves an answer. Of course, we don't have to look to the Middle East to find suffering. We've all experienced suffering of different degrees in our life, some of it physical, some of it emotional, and some of it existential. And we know that a lot of our suffering can be brought on by our own poor decisions, our own consequences. And we call that sin suffering. We suffer because of sin. But we also suffer out of love. We call that love suffering. It's nothing that we've done or anyone else has done, but because we choose to love, we can suffer with another person and feel their pain, and they can suffer with us. And we know that God's greatest desire is to have us love Him and to love one another. And in order for us to do that, we have to be free to choose to love or to not love. We have to be free to choose love or, as I call it, unlove. And when we choose to love, we can find hope, we can find comfort. When we choose not to love, we often find suffering. And so when you look at it from this point of view, suffering is a deprivation we experience as a result of someone's refusal to love. And by love, I mean willing the good of the other as the other. When it's just as easy to do good for the other as it is for ourselves, that is love. And so God, to answer the question, why does God allow it? He will not wipe out our freedom, which means He won't intervene, even if it means stopping someone from unlove, from causing suffering. And from the point of view of faith, it's very important to remember that no suffering is gratuitous. No suffering is gratuitous. God has organized the universe in such a way that despite difficult circumstances, things eventually work out to their best possible outcome. We look at that and we call it redemptive suffering. Because of what Jesus said, pick up your cross and follow me. The outcome of suffering is transformation. So in the Christian view, suffering can be transformed into new life, new opportunity, and new vision by the power of grace. So if we just take a simple example, say St. Maximilian Kolbe, who exchanged his life at Auschwitz concentration camp for the life of another. He transformed the darkness of that situation into hope for another person by choosing to love. And, of course, he transformed his life into new life through the resurrection of Jesus and is declared a saint. Now, we understand that when we look at the cross, we can see through the suffering of Jesus to the resurrection. So that gives us hope that even our own suffering has ultimate meaning. It has significance. It brings with it the opportunity to expand our hearts in love and to be transformed. The problem, of course, is the world doesn't understand suffering. And currently, our own culture sees no meaning in suffering and tries its best to do away with any type of suffering. One of the ways we're trying to do away with suffering is by having an uber stress on equality. If we are all equal in every possible way, if we all have the same amount of money in the bank, if we all have the same amount of material possessions, if we all are just as good looking as the next person, we won't suffer. Because suffering is a result of our desires. And our desires cause us envy, which cause us to suffer, because I have less than you. Sort of a Buddhist view of things. If I rid myself of desire, I rid myself of suffering. But when you look at things from that point of view, you wind up really ending up in despair. Because life tends to be seen as bad, it's brutal, and it's short. I think that's why we have so many depressed people. Or we can end up very cynical. Life is meaningless. Therefore, if anyone suffers, we just find a way to do away with them altogether. So we've come up with abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide, all ways to just do away with those who suffer. And along with that comes the question, if God is all-loving, why does He continue to allow suffering? And of course, that question in and of itself drives people away from God. When they see suffering, they say there can be no God. And so when suffering is not understood, it's a reason for rejecting God. It's why our culture does reject God more and more. So we have to be able to present to our culture a proper understanding of suffering, what its meaning is, and when we fail to grasp it, what the consequences are. And I think we can do that by looking at a simple concept, different levels of happiness that we seek. And we all know that we all have a value that's right front and center. We have our center of gravity, if you will. And on the first level of happiness is physical pleasure. What makes life worthwhile, worth living, is found on the material level. So if I have lots of things, I can feel good. Now, there's nothing wrong with happiness on this level. Certainly the things of this world, God has given us for our enjoyment, for our pleasure. But in this view of happiness, when we're deprived of physical pleasure or stimulation, then we're deprived of fulfillment, then we're deprived of meaning and purpose. We're deprived, in the end, of happiness. And without the physical ability to enjoy things, life becomes meaningless. And so, if I suffer from Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, can no longer enjoy the things of this life, the material things, life becomes meaningless because my happiness is based upon my pleasure and my ability to receive pleasure. On the second level is a happiness that's tied to our achievement. And this is where I compare myself to others. If I have more power than you, if I have more success, I am happy. I'm successful. My self-esteem is intact. But again, if this is the only thing that gives my life meaning, then I certainly will be unhappy and bitter, resentful even, when someone else achieves more than I do. And so in this view, suffering can be good if it makes me advance, if it makes me look better, if it gives me some advantage over another. But when suffering starts to debilitate me, when I begin to lose control, lose self-worth, then my primary purpose and meaning of life is diminished, and I see myself as better off dead. And so this sort of suffering really undermines love. Once I suffer diminishment, put me out of my misery because I'm no longer able to find happiness. On the third level of happiness is the simple desire to do good for the other. And here we stop focusing on ourselves and we begin to look outward. This is quite good, it's altruistic, and we can begin to understand suffering as a failure to love. And when we look about and we see all the suffering in the world, we know somehow it's connected to someone's failure to love, either on an individual level or on a corporate level. If children are starving to death, it's because we failed to love and do what love requires for them. So the problem again here is that too much focused on self, once we realize we can't help everybody, can lead again to despair. Again, since I really can't do it all, what's the point? I can't really find happiness. On the fourth level of happiness is faith in God. A person or a culture who understands happiness on these last two levels of giving love, doing good for the other, and having faith in God sees suffering with having tremendous meaning and value, because it can open the door for the experience of love and goodness. Just think of if you've experienced the death of someone close to you. In your bereavement, people reach out to you and show you love. It becomes a demonstration and opportunity for others to show love and to give love. And so, in this view, suffering, when I have faith in God, may be for me an opportunity to grow in patience, to grow closer to God. Suffering, in fact, in this view has intrinsic meaning because it's an opportunity for love. And even if I can't find much good in my suffering, I can still offer my suffering to God and trust in some way God is allowing something good to come from it, even if I don't know what that is. So the question then comes, does God will suffering? And the answer is no. He's created us in perfect happiness, but he allows the natural consequences of unlove, choosing against love, to take place. And he allows the suffering that we endure to lead to greater things, greater purposes. So unless we make sense of the consequences of unlove, namely suffering, by knowing why we live and having a definition of happiness beyond physical pleasure, ego satisfaction, and even altruism, we will end up despairing, cynical, skeptical, and hopeless. But if our definition of happiness includes God, then the despair of Job turns into the hope of Jesus.